Hey everybody, I'm MS Farzan, and in this video we're going to figure out what 2D game engine you should use for your next game. Let me give you a little bit of background. I'm a tabletop game developer, and I was looking for a 2D game engine to help me build a digital prototype of a card game called Entermancy Hacker Battles so that I could run simulations and make sure that I got the numbers right. I thought there's so many game engines and frameworks out there, it must be relatively simple for me to find one that will work for my card game. Well, it wasn't so simple, and if you've come to this video, you might have already done a bunch of different searches looking for different 2D game engines, and you're not sure which one to use. Well, what I did is what you should not do, and I tried to make that same digital prototype in a bunch of different game engines and frameworks, and I learned a lot, and I'm going to share those learnings with you so that you don't have to do that research and you can just pick one and move forward. So the first framework that I tried for my digital prototype of the card game was React, and you might be saying, hey, wait a minute, React is a front-end framework for doing web development. It has nothing to do with games, and you're mostly right. It's just that I had some background in React, and I'm most comfortable using JavaScript, so I said, well, let me try my hand at making this card game in React, and I had kind of a mixed experience. I found it very easy to spin up the architecture for the user interface for the game because you're basically just making a web page, and I found that it handles game state very well, as what React does is it handles state, so that worked out pretty well. But I ran into some snags when I was trying to do the more complex game architecture for actually the user experience for the game and the drag and drop functionality, because if you're making a card game, you generally need to be able to have a player drag one card over here and drop it here into a drop zone, and then drag another card and make sure that they're dragging it in the right drop zones at the right times, and you might have very complex rules for that sort of thing. So I wouldn't recommend it for making a 2D game, and you're probably not even considering it, but if you're a React developer or a JavaScript developer, it might have crossed your mind. I did try and use other libraries in coordinates with React, such as React DND and BoardGame.io, but in general, I felt that although they were very well-made frameworks, they really weren't serving my purpose of making the digital prototype. And besides, if you're trying to make a 2D game that has like physics, for example, you're not going to get very far in React. So I would say stick to React for front-end development. Maybe choose something else for 2D game development. Then I moved on to Unity, and I thought, okay, I've done some basic games in Unity. I've made some like Space Invaders clones, and I've used tutorials to make like brick breaking games, that sort of thing. And I'm a little bit comfortable in C#, or I should say I was a little bit comfortable in C# at the time. So let me try building my prototype in Unity, and I thought, well, it would be awesome to actually use one of the templates from the asset store, because Unity has a huge asset store that has a bunch of templates for different types of games, 2D as well as 3D games. It has a lot of artwork. If you don't have an artist, if you're not artists yourself, you could perhaps, if you're making a card game, you could use some of the templates that are available there. So I downloaded a bunch of, or a couple trading card game templates, since my game has some TCG elements, and I said, okay, well, let me use one of these to make my game. And here are some things to know about Unity. One, it works with C#, but I don't think it's the best way to learn C#. I think that you should actually learn C# elsewhere, for example, through Microsoft tutorials, and then bring that knowledge to Unity, because if you're trying to learn C# and Unity at the same time, it might be a prohibitive experience, because the Unity editor is pretty complicated. There are layers upon layers. It's almost like learning Photoshop at the same time that you're learning game development or programming, and it's just a lot to keep track of. And specifically for 2D game development, it feels like Unity's 2D platform is a subset of a larger 3D engine. So it's like a lot of things that you're trying to do, it feels like you're shoehorning a 2D game into a 3D space, which isn't necessarily bad. It just doesn't feel very native. And there are some things that are really clunky about the engine, whereas other game engines that we'll talk about do them a little bit more elegantly. For example, Unity has a very serviceable animator if you're trying to do like animations for a platformer or a top-down game, but it's very clunky to use, and the same could be said for pixel perfection. If you're trying to make a pixel perfect game, you're going to have to do some work to massage the editor to make it work for you. I found it to work pretty well for my digital prototype. I didn't get as far with the digital prototype as I would have liked, as Unity takes a lot of work to get your 2D game working properly, as it doesn't feel native. But I would use Unity for other types of games, specifically 3D games. I think it could be very powerful. I actually think that if I were trying to make a platformer or something that had a little bit less logic than the card game, which actually has quite a bit logic, I think it would be a lot easier to use because Unity works with a thing called prefabs that makes it easy to drag and drop stuff and make it more make your workflow a bit more easy. But if you're not already comfortable with C# and you're specifically wanting to do 2D game development, you may want to consider using another game engine than that. If you just want to learn Unity, you want to learn C#, it has everything for you. But with the asset store, if that's a draw for you, I would just say think heavily about it, because it definitely was a draw for me. And I was like, hey, I'll just slot in this template and change a little bit of things and change some of the logic and add some new cards, and I'll have my card game. It didn't work that way at all. The templates that I downloaded, although they were very well made, are structured around being a Hearthstone clone or a Magic the Gathering clone. They don't work for my game specifically, so I found that if I were going to go ahead and make the full digital prototype or the full digital game using Unity, I would have to do as much work rebuilding the code base that they'd already provided for me in those templates than I would if I just built it from scratch myself. So that was my experience with the asset store. I also used another game engine called Godot engine. It's a free and open source game engine that has its own programming language called GDScript. But I also saw that it supports C# and even C++ and Python if you're willing to go the extra mile to integrate that. And I think it's a wonderful little game engine. It doesn't have the same glamour and pedigree as something like Unity or GameMaker or some of the other more popular game engines out there. But I said, let me give it a shot, and I really enjoy the way that they have the editor set up. It has a node-based workflow, which is a bit different from Unity's prefabs and different from other things that you'll see out there. But once you get into it, you'll warm to it quickly, and it's pretty intuitive. I don't know about shipping a game with Godot engine, in that I haven't shipped a game with the other engines, but at least things like Unity and GameMaker, they have a long list of popular games that have come out on multiple platforms, and they just work. So you can be more confident with those game engines that once you get to that stage, there will be support there for you. But one thing to note about Godot engine is that I came to it having some C# background, and particularly after coming from Unity, feeling more comfortable with C# and thinking that I was just going to apply that knowledge to Godot engine, as it says that it's supported. But I didn't find the support to be as good as its support for GDScript. All the documentation is in GDScript, and there's some documentation for C#, but you're not going to find like a lot of tutorials about using C# with Godot engine and as many resources. I think that to be the most productive, if you're not already like a super awesome programmer, is really to use GDScript and use the engine the way that it's meant to be used. For me, I'm a more multi-purpose programmer. I enjoy learning more about JavaScript, C# and other programming languages in different contexts. So I didn't want to learn GDScript or work so heavily in GDScript. So that was a little bit of an issue for me, but that might not be an issue for you. And if you want something free and open source to use, I think you could use Godot engine. Another game engine that I used and that you're probably considering is GameMaker Studio 2. Unlike the other engines that and frameworks that I've mentioned so far, GameMaker Studio 2 does have a cost associated with it. After you complete the 30-day free trial, you're going to have to put up some money. But I found in my 30-day free trial attempting to make the prototype that the game engine itself, the editor, was very accessible. It was really easy to onboard to as a new person to GameMaker Studio 2. I think a lot of the things they do are very intuitive. Specifically the workflow and the way that they handle your own user face when you're working, I think is very elegantly done. Animations, for example, are a breeze to work with, and everything just seems to work very well in terms of actually developing your game. One of my hangups is that it uses a proprietary coding language called GML, which isn't like super complex or hard to learn or anything like that. It's just it doesn't follow a lot of the conventions that one might be used to or one might want to learn when working with object-oriented programming languages. For example, if you're coming from JavaScript or C# or other languages, you might scratch your head at some of the things that GML does or some of the things that GameMaker Studio 2 wants you to do with GML. Although it does have drag and drop functionality as well, but I didn't use that. I just attempted to use GML. And if you don't care about that kind of thing, that's fine. You could go for it. If you're looking to learn programming through using GML and GameMaker Studio 2, your mileage might vary. I mean, you can absolutely learn to code using GML, and it will teach you some of the basics of programming, but it doesn't follow a lot of the conventions that you'll need to get used to when using other programming languages, and it doesn't show you, for example, how to structure clean code and that sort of thing. That's a little bit of a sticking point for me. I think I would have gone further with GameMaker Studio if it allowed me to use JavaScript or C# or another language that I could use elsewhere and get experience with elsewhere. I had a little bit of trouble with the drag and drop functionality in terms of the game that I'm making, the card game. The pointer doesn't seem to follow or want to follow the card when you're dragging very accurately. So it requires some scaffolding to work. But I think if you're making other types of games other than card games, but still 2D games, you could probably go very far if you're willing to learn and work in GML and you're also willing to pay the fee of entrance. You've probably also heard of Construct 3, which is another 2D game engine. It's a really easy engine to learn. I found it to be extremely accessible. It kind of looks like an upgraded version of Microsoft Paint, whatever that tells you. But I think it's very well implemented. It has drag and drop tools, which are not my favorite. I'd rather code from scratch, but it does have some JavaScript functionality if you want to extend it with JavaScript. But my main sticking point with Construct 3 is that to really do any damage and make any progress, you're going to have to get past a pretty steep paywall, in my opinion, where you have to pay like $99 a year as a subscription to use more than just the bare bones demo that they allow you to do. And so I didn't love that aspect of it. If that's not an issue for you and you're willing to just pay to make your prototype or make your game, I think you could go pretty far in Construct. It's really easy to use. It feels really natural. The animation works great. The drag and drop, as I mentioned, is not my cup of tea, but it's really easy to use. And my main sticking point with it is simply the price tag. Now, if you're already a programmer or you want to learn more JavaScript and more about the JavaScript ecosystem, or if you prefer to learn and make your games purely in code, you might try your hand at Phaser, specifically Phaser 3, which is actually the game framework that I've made the most progress in for my digital card game. Phaser is Phaser 2 was heavily documented and there are a bunch of tutorials out there for it. Phaser 3 is totally the opposite. There's a bunch of official documentation and examples for Phaser 3, but not a lot of context around them. So you're going to be doing a lot of searching, a lot of the groundwork yourself, a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of setting up your own integrated development environment, learning to use the command line and GitHub for your version control, and probably also learning some of the JavaScript ES6 best practices and conventions to make your game. For me, it's been an incredible learning process using Phaser, and just better progress both for my game and for me as a developer. Really doing a lot of the heavy lifting myself and searching Stack Overflow all the time, getting on the Phaser Discord, asking questions, looking for answers everywhere, and getting stuck, and then getting unstuck, and creating my own solutions for stuff. That's been really fun and interesting for me, and I've made a lot of headway and progress in it, but it might not be your cup of tea. You might just want to say, I want a game engine that's going to make me productive as a game developer as soon as possible. And for that, I would say choose something like GameMaker or Construct if you're willing to pay the money, or even Unity 2D. Of course, Godot is there, but it's also going to require a bit of an investment on your part in terms of the learning and the resources out there. For me, Phaser has been really fun to work with, really frustrating in terms of finding answers, but better for me as a developer as a whole. And like I said, I've been most productive on my prototype with Phaser. That doesn't mean that will be the same case for you. You might be more productive elsewhere, but if you want to build something in 2D completely from scratch and have a lot of tools available that you might have to search to figure out how they work. Like, for example, it took me a while to figure out how to make drag and drop functionality work in the game, not in terms of making the game, but for the user experience, being able to drag and drop cards. I had to figure out how to make that work and look at the examples to figure out how to make drop zones for those cards. But once I did, it's a really, really elegantly scripted game in comparison to how I would do that in Unity or how I would do it in GameMaker or other game engines. It handles 2D very natively, and it's really useful, but it will require an investment on your part if you're not already a JavaScript programmer and not already familiar with how to set up an integrated development environment and that kind of thing. So my summary for you about what 2D game engine or framework to use is based on my experience looking at each of these different game engines and actually trying to make a prototype with varying results within each of these game engines and frameworks. Starting with React, if you're a JavaScript programmer and specifically a React developer and are thinking about making a 2D game, it's really going to depend on what kind of game you want to make and what kind of functionality it has. I feel like I could have gotten somewhere if I stuck with it longer for a card game, but I wouldn't suggest trying to make like anything that uses physics, like a platformer with React. I just think there's better options out there for you. If you are thinking or considering about using Unity, it depends on what you want to use Unity for and how willing you are to work with the editor to get it to do what you want it to do. 2D game development in Unity still feels like it's shoehorned into a 3D space. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that you're going to have to work harder to achieve things like pixel perfection or the way that you use the animator, for example. It feels archaic compared to other 2D game engines that are out there that are natively 2D. That doesn't mean that it won't work for you. It's just that it's going to take more work. And if you're looking at the asset store, for example, and saying, hey, it's already got a bunch of templates that I can just plop my game in, well, your mileage may vary, as it did for me, in that I thought I was just going to use a template and make this digital card game based on something that somebody had already else made. But it turns out that it was going to take me just as much work to try and make their template work for me and rebuild their code base so that it worked for my game as it would for me to just build my game from scratch. And one other note about Unity, if you're thinking about learning Unity so that you can learn C#, I would say come to it with C#. Actually do some tutorials, maybe through Microsoft's tutorials first. Get your foundation of what C# is and what object-oriented programming is before you come to Unity, because trying to learn C# and Unity at the same time might be too much at the same time, because Unity, the editor itself, is kind of a bear and it needs its own learning process and it has its own learning curve to be productive in. If you're thinking about Godot engine, well, it's a really nice engine, and it's open source and free to use, which is awesome. just beware that if you're coming to it from a different programming language and you're thinking, hey, I'll use C# or C++ or Python, and not its GD script, which is what it really wants you to use, you won't find the same kind of documentation and support for those other languages as you would for GD script. If you're prepared to use Godot and use it with GD script for 2D game development, I think you could do pretty well. It doesn't have the same pedigree as some of the other game engines in terms of popular games that have been released that you might be able to name off the top of your head, but you still could do a lot of work in it if you're prepared to use GD script, or if you're so confident in those other languages that you're willing to do the work on your own. You could try your hand at GameMaker Studio 2, which I found super easy to use, very beginner friendly. It has a really nice intuitive workflow, especially for things like animations and pixel perfection. I think it's a great 2D game engine. Just beware that it uses a proprietary language called GML, which doesn't follow a lot of the conventions of other more popular object-oriented programming languages. So if you're looking to like learn programming, for example, using GML, you could probably do that, but it's not going to teach you some of the best practices of coding, like, for example, keeping clean code. It's just going to teach you how to use GML for GameMaker Studio 2, and it's also GML isn't applicable elsewhere. Like, you can't go build a website with it or something. So just beware of that. If that's not an issue to you, you'll probably be fine in GameMaker Studio. Just know also that after your 30-day free trial, you will have to pay up to continue using the game engine. If you're considering Construct 3, which is another 2D game engine, you might really enjoy it, as I did. I really enjoyed using Construct for the way that it builds games. It's super intuitive and easy to use. It looks kind of like an upgraded Microsoft Paint, so it's not the prettiest to look at, and it kind of feels like a toy, but it's really intuitive and easy to use for 2D games. I really like the way that it handles animations, and I just think it's very user-friendly, but it has a pretty steep paywall if you want to do anything more than just try out its very bare bones demo. So if you're willing to spend $99 a year or more, you might make great progress in it. But once I hit that, my usage of the demo, I just said, I'm not willing to spend that much money on a game framework that I'm just making a digital prototype in, so I didn't use it more than that. So just beware, it does come with a price tag. And finally, if you want to get the experience of making a game completely from scratch, just using code and not a visual editor of any kind, you might try your hand at Phaser 3. I've had a really good experience with Phaser 3, both in learning the game framework itself and in just learning JavaScript best practices and how ES6 works. And it's forced me to set up my own IDE for it, and it's forced me to get better at the command line and using Git and just kind of like working in a real development environment. And I don't mean to say that the other game engines are not real development environments. It's just that this one it's very, very choose your own adventure. You really have to do a lot of the work yourself, specifically because there's not a lot of documentation and tutorials outside of the official documentation and examples, which don't have a lot of context around them. So if you want that like sit at your computer and like do everything yourself experience and search Stack Overflow for answers and not find them there, and then go onto the Phaser Discord and ask questions there and share your code with people and try to apply different things to make your code better. Basically, if you want to be a better programmer and have that experience while making your 2D game engine, then you might try out Phaser 3. Otherwise, you might be more productive elsewhere if you just want to make 2D games. One other note is that there are a bunch of other 2D game engines out there. Like, I've been recommended to check out Love 2D, which is built on Lua, or Monogame, which uses C#. And I haven't spent any time with them, so I'm not able to speak to them. But just use this information to kind of structure your thoughts about what's going to be the best workflow for you and what's going to work best for the type of game that you're trying to use. Obviously, my experience has been trying to make a digital card game, which you might be trying to make a top-down game or a story-based game or a digital novel type game or a platformer or something like that. Some engines do that better than others, and your mileage might vary, and hopefully this information has been useful to you. If money is an issue, know that most of the game engines that I've mentioned, they either have they're either free to use, like React, although I know I said I didn't recommend it. It's free to use. Phaser is free to use. Godot is free to use. There are no costs associated with them. But a lot of other ones, they do have costs associated with them, like GameMaker Studio 2. Just to use it after your free trial, you're going to have to pay money. Construct 3, after you exhaust a very bare bones free demo, you're going to have to pay a subscription fee. And then other game engines, including ones like GameMaker, when you deploy a game, if you want to deploy it on different platforms, if you're deploying on PC, you might not have to pay anything, but you might have to have a splash screen if you're using Unity, or if you don't want to have that splash screen, or if you want to deploy on different platforms like PS4 and Xbox, or on mobile, you might have to shell out extra money just to have that functionality. So take that in consideration and try and have the long view about what you want to do with the game and how you want to deploy it. If you're specifically looking at just like learning programming or learning game development, that might not matter as much. But if you're looking at the long term and you're saying, well, I want to deploy on mobile, I want to deploy my mobile 2D game, how much is it going to cost me in the long run? That might be something to price out now to help you when you're working on it later. Thanks so much for watching my video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter for more crunchy content. You can also check out my books and games, and we'll see you soon.